Okay, everybody, thank you very much for being with us for this episode of the MirYam Institute podcast. And today we are having a special commemoration in light of us coming to Israel Remembrance Day for the fallen, not only the fallen soldiers of the Israel Defense Forces, but also those who fell by way of horrific and horrendous terror attacks against the citizens of the state of Israel. And whether you're watching during this briefing or you're going to be listening to this in the podcast or watching on JBS in the postcast, we appreciate your time, and we are very pleased to be joined not only by MirYam in-house analyst Yaakov Lappin, who for years has reported on all matters military with regards to the state of Israel, but also by my colleague and co-founder of the MirYam Institute, Rozita Pnini, who is also a veteran of service in the Israel Defense Forces. She's in Israel now. I'm here in the United States of America, which I can confide is an odd place to be, particularly during Yom Hazikaron, during Israel's Remembrance Day. And for those of you who are not familiar with what goes on in the States of Israel, this is not like a Memorial Day elsewhere, or for example, here in the USA. Memorial Day tends to be a day that is couched in celebration and barbecues and days off and even vacations. It's not like that in the States of Israel. In the States of Israel, everybody knows somebody who has been touched by way of one or both of the aforementioned categories, a fallen soldier or a fallen victim of terror. And so to meet Remembrance Day with ebullience and celebration would be a complete contradiction. So we are here as we're about to step into Memorial Day. It's not quite upon us yet. We have about another 45 to 50 minutes or so. And as I mentioned, Rozita Pnini is here. We at the MirYam Institute are one of the very few organizations who have at the top of their organizational tree two veterans, two individuals who've gone through war. I went through the Second Lebanon War. That was the first war in which I fought and served. Rozita went through the First Lebanon War in 1982. And it's with that in mind that I'd like you, Yaakov, to really get things going, if you would, and begin by asking Rozita a few questions about her service, her reflections, and her thoughts on this day.
Sure. Thank you very much, Benjamin. And why don't we just jump right to that? Rozita, I would love for you to tell us about your own military service during the Lebanon War in the 1980s. And then I would be very interested in hearing about how you personally commemorate Yom Hazikaron, the Memorial Day.
Hi, everyone. Thank you so much for having me today. As Benjamin has said, you know, it's one of the days in the calendars of that we commemorate the soldiers that we have lost. And it's a hard day for, I think, the entire population of Israel. And this year I've been really blessed to be here after many, many years that I have commemorated that day in the United States. So Benjamin has said that I have served in the First Lebanon War, but I have experienced as a citizen other wars of Israel. And the first war that I can remember is the 6-Day War as a really young child, but I still remember the happening in my household. And then as a teenager, the Yom Kippur War. And then going into the army in the beginning of the 80s, we really went into, as a group, I served in the Nachal Brigade, and we were very naive 18-year-old who went into the Nachal Brigade, which back then we used to help the kibbutzim really flourish, and never thought that I will experience a war, and the feeling of losing, or even a slight idea that I'll be losing close friends. And I believe that it was almost 6 months before we finished our service that the First Lebanon War has broke. And I remember the chaos. I totally remember how it was not even organized, because I remember speaking with the boys, and back then only boys could go to the front line. I remember that we couldn't hear from them. We didn't know what happened to them. We didn't know where they were. The only news that we got back from their front line, if somebody was fallen, because we had to go be with the families. And it was something that it was beyond any kind of understanding. How can we speak and engage on one day, and then the next day it would be a total chaos? And I think that the Lebanon war has not left a very good understanding. Why are we fighting for what we're fighting when we had so many losses? And I think the realization has came to a lot of us. And until today, when I speak, I'm still in touch with all my friends from the service. And we still speak about that war. We still speak about the friends that we lost. And I think that it took us a long time. And when I say long time, I'm saying years to understand really what happened. And that brings me up to a point that I realized just yesterday. Yesterday, I took a trip to the Mount Hermon, and they explained to us what happened in the Yom Kippur War. And that was a war that I really did not have any part of it. But I think until yesterday, when we spoke with people that fought there, that experienced what happened there, something really clicked within me, and I totally could connect with what these people felt after that war. So I think for me, in a way, it had made me step away from a place that I grew up in, that I dearly love. And I think that the only way that it brought me back is really when I used to come to Israel every single year, no matter what. I used to bring my children and no matter what. But I think that since I started working with Benjamin at previously Our Soldiers Speak and now the MirYam Institute, I think the work at the MirYam and Our Soldiers Speak really brought me back home. Really gave me the understanding of no matter what, as many dear people to me that I have lost, I understood why we did it.
Thank you
So
very much
my
for sharing
answer
that.
is long, but
No, it was a very powerful and significant answer, Rozita, and I very much appreciate you sharing that with us. And you said something that I thought was very interesting, and perhaps if I know that you're on your way to a memorial ceremony, but if you have time just to expand on this point, you talked about this very unique Israeli experience that young soldiers, some of them find themselves doing, which is meeting up with the families who just very recently would have lost a loved one in combat. Can you describe what that's like at such a young age to offer that support to a family? From your perspective, what was that like?
it was a total agony. You asked me the question and it totally brings me to a very emotional place, because it was no words, it was no doing, it was no gesture that you could have done for these families to ease it for them. Because here we are, here existing, continuing our lives. And here are these families who have to deal with the loss every single day of their life. And it can totally destroy families, and it can totally strengthen families. But the majority of families that I've been involved with could not grasp the understanding, the feeling, to cope with a loss of a loved one. It's just not normal. It's not in our nature to understand. So the grief, I
Yes.
don't think that it ever ends. I think for us, even seeing the families is somewhat, in a way, stays with us. It's not, pictures or feelings that you can dismiss, and it comes back every single year. And
Yes.
it should.
Yeah.
I believe strongly that we as nation, people, country, we need to remember.
Yeah, absolutely. And what you're saying, by the way, aligns very well with things that I was speaking to the national coordinator from the Defense Ministry's coordination commemoration department, who's specifically in charge of taking care of minority families, Druze and Bedouin and other minority groups who have lost soldiers in combat in the IDF. And one of the things he said was that, Memorial Day, it's very similar to what you just said. Memorial Day is for the whole of the nation, but the families, for them, it's every day. There's not a single day that they don't feel that pain. And so this day is really for all of us to connect to them and to remember the impossible sacrifices that they made so that, we have our independence and our security. So Rozita, I know that you're on your way to a ceremony, and we want to make sure that you get there on time. So thank you very much for sharing these very powerful memories, which have moved me to hear this, and I'm sure all of our listeners and viewers as well. So thank you very much.
And Rozita, I'm going to take over from Yaakov for just one question that I really who on September 9th, 1996, was abducted on his way home. His name was Sharon Edry of blessed memory. And Sharon was on a break from his military service, but not a break of leisure. He was on a break because he was seeking out medical treatment for ongoing sickness and illness and so forth. And after he'd gone between various medical stations in the IDF and seeking to go home, he actually hitchhiked. He hitchhiked a ride from wherever it was that he was, and he was abducted. Essentially, he was abducted by terrorists, and he became aware only after he entered that vehicle that he had been abducted. Those who had abducted him sensed that he'd become aware that his life was in danger, and they killed him. And they not only killed him, but they then hid the body. And then ultimately his body was recovered many, many weeks, even months later. And tragically, most disturbingly, his body was recovered, buried in two different places. The terrorists having cut his body in half, one half in one area, the other half in another area, and his upper torso was uncovered, and within his fist was clenched his kippah, his yarmulke. This was an Orthodox soldier, Sharon Edry. I want you to tell everybody here about your connection to Sharon Edry, if you would.
Sure. So I know Sharon since he was a very young child, because my brother-in-law, Yoram Edry, is Sharon's eldest brother. So my sister has met Yoram Edry in the army when they were 17 years old. And Sharon was the youngest child of the Edry family. So I know him since he was 9 years old. And I have to say that when Sharon got missing, we all did not understand how could something like that happen. He was hitchhiking, and right away my brother-in-law and his sister at the time, who lived in the US as well, they flew back to Israel to look for what can they do. And it took about 4 months until we found out that it was a big incident in Israel that terrorists blew out a coffee place. And in one of the pockets of the terrorists it was something that identified Sharon, and they couldn't understand how he has an artifact of Sharon with him. And it happens to be that they interrogated him, and he revealed where Sharon was. And it took about 4 months until they found the body. And that was after the media and the army and the politicians had made so many different statements that he ran away from home, that probably the family doesn't want him to serve. So it was very long, agonizing months until they actually found the body of Sharon. And I want you to know that Sharon's parents has never recovered since then. His father has gotten sicker and sicker every year, and we just lost him 3 months ago, even less, 2.5 months ago. And his mom, until today, she tells the story, she speaks about him. And, you know, as a soldier, we have something called diskit. It's your identity badge that you wear on your neck. And until today, she refused to break it. She still has it on her, wearing it on her neck. And her request is that when she's gone, she wants that to stay with her. And obviously the brothers and sisters until today, and still it's within them. He was just a child. He was only 19 years old when he got murdered. And it's something that every one of them until today, they have, next week they have, like they do a bike for a ride for his memory. They built a whole memorial place for him. And if you guys are interested, it's a whole movie about it if you want to watch and hear the story. So it's part of our immediate family and the entire family of Israel. That is our story.
Thank you, Rozita. Thank you very much for sharing that with us. As we mentioned, we know that you're on your way to your own tekes on Yom Hazikaron, on Israel Remembrance Day, so we'll leave you to go there. And I'm very pleased that you contributed to this conversation. Everybody who follows the work of the Institute knows a little bit about my own experience serving. I think people know far less about your own, and I'm very pleased that you felt comfortable sharing just some of that with us here today. Thank you for enhancing the understanding of everybody who listened.
Thank you so much, everybody. I know today is our Memorial Day, but tomorrow night, we're going to start celebrating our Independence Day. So thank you very much for all our listeners. Thank you so much for all of our supporters at the MirYam Institute. Thank you so much, Yaakov. Thank you so much, Benjamin. And I'm looking forward to listening to the extent of the program. So thank you so much. Bye-bye. So
Yaakov, it's over to you. Quite a wrenching story there about Sharon Edrei. I don't know if everybody knows this, but for those who've been to Israel, you'll oftentimes see soldiers boarding buses, and typically those soldiers will be wearing military uniform. And there's a law actually in the state of Israel that any soldier wearing military uniform plus holding a valid military ID card is entitled to free public transportation. And the reason for that is actually what befell tragically Sharon Edrei. It was a law that was named after Sharon Edrei, and as Rozita said, very, very close to home, his older brother being married to Rozita's sister. And I wish I could say that that's an exceptional story. Unfortunately, it's not an exceptional story. It's a harrowing story in the diaspora. It's almost commonplace within the state of Israel. And it's certainly served to power much of the work that we do here at the Institute. But I had the privilege of meeting Sharon's father prior to his passing, and you could see the weariness in his eyes, and you could see the sense of bereavement in his eyes. In his mother's eyes, less so. She seemed to derive a certain strength from the need to continue to spread his story and his message and the lessons learned from his service. But as Rozita said so aptly just a moment ago, some people derive strength from it. Some people are broken by the sense of loss. Who are we to judge who will go in either direction? May we know a time when everybody is spared having to react in any way whatsoever to such tragedies. But anyway, it's over to you, Yaakov.
Amen. Okay, so I think the next thing that we should look at is a statement that was made by the Israeli Defense Ministry on Friday. Now, it released some important information both about exactly what we're commemorating and what the next 24 hours will hold. So I'm just going to take us through what they've sent. So first of all, they are giving us the figure of 24,213 soldiers that have fallen from 1860 until today. So they are counting victims of hostile action from the pre-state era right up until today in that figure. And they're saying an additional 59 soldiers fell this past year, as well as 86 disabled veterans who passed away due to their condition. And all were officially recognized by the Ministry of Defense. Now, in terms of what is going to happen very soon here in Israel in 25 minutes at 8 p.m., 35 minutes, there's going to be a 1-minute siren that will sound throughout the whole country, marking the start of Remembrance Day for Israel's fallen. And that will also be the sign to begin memorial ceremonies throughout the entire country right after the siren. There will be a central ceremony at the Western Wall in Jerusalem that will be attended by the President of the State of Israel and the IDF Chief of Staff. And tomorrow we're going to have a 2-minute siren that will sound at 11 a.m., again nationwide, and that will mark the beginning of ceremonies at 52 military ceremonies. The main one will be at Mount Herzl in Jerusalem, and that again will be in the presence of the Israeli president, as well as the Israeli prime minister and senior officials. So those are the main figures that are characterizing the next 24 hours. And I'd like to bring this now to you, Benjamin, because I think that this day has major significance to you, both on a personal and a national level. And that's the first question that I want to direct towards you. What does this day mean to you personally, and what does this day mean to you nationally?
Yeah, so first of all, Yaakov, I want to just reiterate to you that I know that you have to stand up and observe the silence that everybody will observe nationally. So we'll run faithful to your time constraints, and I appreciate you making time today. And I think that in order to understand what this means to me personally, one has to go back a little bit into my own childhood. So I was raised in a very Orthodox home and very engaged in community work and community activities. And one central aspect of our community activities, long before the pro-Israel space really gained ground the way that it has done today, was that we would open our home to host, and as would various members of the community, to host veterans of service in the Israel Defense Forces. And I remember very, very clearly when they would come into our community, usually around Yom Hazikaron, Israel Remembrance Day, as being around the dinner table in my home in Leeds, England. And my father was a criminal defense attorney, and on the Shabbatot and on the Chagim, he was also a cantor, a chazan. And all of his friends were criminal defense attorneys. And if they weren't criminal defense attorneys, then they were attorneys of a different kind. And if not attorneys, they were doctors, and they were accountants, they were professors, and they were business owners, and so on and so forth. And I understood very, very clearly that that's what Jewish people were. Jewish people, like many peoples in this world, were functioning, earning, professional, upstanding members of their society. And that was my frame of reference for Jews and people my father's age and beyond. That's what I would interact with in the synagogue. That's what I would interact with at community events. And then during the Yom Hazikaron gathering with veterans of the IDF, I would hear these veterans, people with the names of Shlomi and Avi and Shmulik and Itzi and who knows what other names, they would all sit around and they too would be attorneys and they would be professors and they would be business owners and they would be economists and they would be doing whatever it was that they did professionally. But the departure point between their life story and the life stories of adults around which I'd grown up was that they had also fought. These Israelis had also fought and they had served and they had been injured, and many of them bore the battle scars from the wars in which they served, and some of them had bullets that remained lodged within their bodies to that very day and for all the days of their remaining life. And in my mind, as a young child watching this and looking on and listening to these conversations, that set them apart. This was a different breed of Jew, a breed of Jew that I hadn't encountered until I met these veterans. And I wanted to be that kind of Jew. And a long story short, after I graduated from university, I moved to Israel and had the privilege of serving, went through all of my service training, which lasted for many, many months. And then after having been told very, very clearly, as rockets began to be fired from southern Lebanon into northern Israel, that my brigade would absolutely not be in any way, shape or form involved in the Second Lebanon War, we then got a counter command which informed us that we would be centrally involved in the Second Lebanon War, and we were going to cross the border and fight and to serve. And as we readied for that, Yaakov, I remember the Miluimnikim, the reservists that reported to the line while we young, possibly naive conscripts checked our ammunition levels and water supplies and so on and so forth. And I remember these reservists coming onto our base, and some of them had, their shirts were open and they had sunglasses atop their heads, and many of them had cigarettes draping out of their mouths, but they all had rifles with them, and they all down to the last, some of them in better shape than others, some of them had maintained their physical condition better than others. Every single one of them was armed with the notion that with this rifle, they will turn this circumstance around, back on itself, and for the betterment of the Jewish state and the Jewish people. And so I realized that perception that there are a group of men and women set apart within the Jewish story that I first felt and first recognized when I was a young child around the dinner table in Leeds, that perception proved to be wholly aligned with the reality. These people are a breed apart. They are a different kind of Jew. And I saw that, I perceived that as a child, I saw it as an adult, and having gone through my conscripted service in the Second Lebanon War, and then my reserve duty up to the time that I concluded my reserve duty, which was only a couple of years ago, I can tell you that these reservists, these men, these women, these Jews and non-Jews who serve in the defense of the one and only Jewish state, they're a breed apart. They make the ultimate sacrifice when asked to do so. And they're frankly a band of ordinary people tasked with undertaking extraordinary deeds. And thank God for them, and thank God that they have shoulders broad enough to bear that responsibility.
Okay, thank you very much for sharing that. That's an extremely powerful account, and I think it ties together very well the fabric of personal and national. I think that really underpins your own story. It's completely intertwined here. Now, what I want to do is read out a portion, not the whole thing, of a column that was published yesterday by the IDF Chief of Staff, Lieutenant General Herzi Halevi. And I think that there are two things that we should focus on as we go over his text. And we'll look at those two things right after we get through it. So first of all, he's writing a column that's called "If Only for One Sacred Day." And just before I read a little bit from it, it's about a fallen soldier called Jonathan Boyden. He was born in Manchester, England in 1974. He made Aliyah when he was 12 with his family. In 1992, he enlisted in the Shayetet 13, Navy SEALs, for a year and 2 months. And then he transferred to an elite paratroop unit called Orev, that's a company. And he was stationed in Israel's security zone in southern Lebanon that had been established to defend Israel's northern regions from Palestinian and Hezbollah terrorist and rocket and mortar attack. And on July 9th, 1993, Yonatan was sent in an APC, that's an armored personnel carrier, to rescue another unit that had come under enemy fire near the Lebanese village of Sujud. That's in the eastern part of the security zone. And he was killed by an explosive at the age of 19. And for anybody who has been following Israel and its defense struggles for the past decades, the weekly news of losses from the security zone in southern Lebanon was something that was a tragic feature of the weekly news cycle at that time. And the chief of staff, Halevi, wants to concentrate on him. And what he's saying is, here's what he wrote, amongst other things: among the many fallen soldiers whose memory we honor this week, the figure of the late Yonatan Boyden comes to mind. As a young man, Yonatan and his parents immigrated to Israel from the UK. I first met him when I interviewed him for the Olev company of the Paratroopers Brigade. When he spoke of his desire to be a combat soldier and protect the country he immigrated to, I saw a spark in his eyes. I welcomed him into the company and knew he would be an excellent soldier and a true brother in arms. Yonatan suffered serious wounds in battle at Jabal Sejud in the north of the security zone in Lebanon, and died of these wounds. He loved life and was willing to risk his own for the sake of the state of Israel. This is where our independence takes shape, the place where the choice of life meets the willingness to sacrifice it to defend the state of Israel. And the first thing I want to ask you, Benjamin, is how do you relate to Boyden's story?
So I relate to Boyden's story in some ways, and in other ways I find it impossible to relate to it. I'll deal with the latter part of my answer first. I struggled for a very long time after service, specifically following the events of the Second Lebanon War, with the idea that I'd survived. I made a considered decision to go and serve in the IDF, like Boyden. From the United Kingdom, I volunteered for service. And when I was weighing that up, Yaakov, I didn't weigh it up in a cowboyish manner. I weighed it up in a very, very clear-eyed way, thinking very, very deliberately about what sacrifices I felt would be worth enduring, what sacrifices I felt would be worth paying in order to have the privilege of service in the Israel Defense Forces. And so I would ask myself, if I was to lose a limb, would that be worth it? If I was to lose my sight, would that be worth it? And if I was to lose my life, would that be worth it? And I ultimately decided that the answer would be yes, in the affirmative to all of those questions, that no matter the cost, no matter the sacrifice that was inflicted upon me potentially, it would all be worth it if I was to have the privilege of serving within the Israel Defense Forces. And so I boarded a plane and I had that privilege and I undertook that privilege. And I remember very, very clearly, for example, there was a point during the Second Lebanon War when we were held up in a house in southern Lebanon. We'd gone to a village and there was a house there in which we ensconced ourselves, and that house came to the attention of Hezbollah and they sought to destroy that house. And there were tens of soldiers in there in different parts of the house. And I remember very, very clearly as rockets began to be fired and munitions and so on and so forth towards our position, I remember very clearly the Magad, which is the Mefaked of the Gdud, a commander, battalion. Battalion commander within the Israel Defense Forces, calling to his radio man. Now, a radio man is a key member of the team, at least it was back when I served, because part of the task of the radio man was to faithfully transmit words from base command to his commander, and also to run back and forth along the line of soldiers in formation as they move between objectives and relay the response of the battalion commander to each and every one of those soldiers. Now, today, perhaps every soldier has an earpiece and a radio and it's more easily communicated, but back then it wasn't the case. There was one radio man and he would run back and forth along these lines. And I remember that with all of this going on, which was difficult enough, rockets being fired towards the house in which we found ourselves, that the Magad, the brigade commander, called his radio man who was at rest at that time. And he said, "Can you come into the other room? I need to speak to you." And the radio man, just before he stood up, said to the commander, "Do I need my radio?" do I need to bring my radio with me? And the commander said no. And he brought him to the other room. And I could hear this because I was in a particular position on duty. And he said to that radio man that he wanted to inform him that he was to be evacuated from the battlefield because his brother had been killed in a battle in the village one over from where we were. And when you see that, when you see people who are so completely affected by way of war, when you see that they've lost their loved ones and so forth, you do find yourself, at least I did, I found myself burdened by the question, why are these people taken and I have survived? Now I'm over that question now. I understand how I can deal with the reality that while others were taken, I was not. But for many, many months and even years after my service, specifically in the Second Lebanon War, as opposed to other campaigns, it took me a very, very long time to conjure with the notion that while 122, 123 soldiers had fallen in the Second Lebanon War, I was not one of those soldiers. And I think that, unfortunately, tragically, Chief of Staff Herzi Halevi could open up a book of names of fallen soldiers, and behind so many of those names, he would find stories of heroism and of sacrifice and of unusual courage in the face of tremendous challenge. Some of us are fortunate enough to have our courage lead us to days after the guns have fallen silent, and others fall and are cut down by those very guns. And it seems that Boyden was one such individual, and I thank the Chief of Staff for bringing his story to our attention.
And I thank you for bringing your story to everybody's attention who's listening to this. I think that the dilemma that you describe and the struggle of surviving this war intact, thank God, is something that only people who have been on the front line and have risked their lives for the defense of the country have to grapple with. And I think that's, it's such a uniquely difficult experience. I think that, it's one of those things where you have to experience it to understand it. And I thank you very much for sharing that, for your openness.
Ironically, Yaakov, I'll just if we're in the business of sharing, and I should emphasize to people, you and I did not take the time and we really frankly didn't want to prepare for this because our conversation is supposed to be of a more candid nature. I will tell you ironically that I am of the belief that had I not served in the Israel Defense Forces, had I not obeyed that inner calling to go and to serve and to fight and to don the uniform of the IDF, I actually think that it is highly unlikely that I would be around today. I actually believe that the sense of regret and the sense of not reporting to the line and the sense of disobeying my inner beliefs and my inner instincts, I think that would have rendered a continuation of my life quite a challenge, knowing myself as I do, because I'm someone who needed the fight. I needed a righteous fight. I needed to get into the fight. And so as much as I spent the immediate period of time after the Second Lebanon War facing down tremendous inner turmoil and struggle, I think that in the long term, of course, that was merely a bump in the road toward a fulfilled life, one which was punctuated by a very clear sense of mission and correct mission, that of serving the one and only Jewish state.
And that in itself is a remarkable statement that perhaps we can explore at a future time.
Sure.
Now, there's one thing that the Chief of Staff said at the end of his column, and he also said it at the beginning. And what he wrote was this: if only for a moment, if only for one sacred day. Now, he does not complete that sentence, so I will complete it for him. And what he's saying is, if only for a moment, if only for one sacred day, we can keep politics out. That is what the Chief of Staff is saying here. And the reason he has said this is because we have seen unprecedented scenes in recent days in which a series of government ministers have had to pull out of memorial events at cemeteries in recent days because of protests by bereaved families. And the protests focused on 2 points. One was saying, don't send these ministers who evaded service, primarily from ultra-Orthodox parties, but not only. And the second was protesting ministers who had condemned reservists for political activities on behalf of the protest movement. Now, I hate to bring in politics, but because the Chief of Staff and the whole of the State of Israel is facing a Memorial Day that it has never faced before, one that is being marred by politics, I think we cannot ignore the fact that this is happening, and we need to weigh in on this new struggle, this new dimension for Israel marking its Memorial Day. Do you think that we are able, for one sacred day, to keep politics out? And should we keep politics out? How do you view this very, very challenging Memorial Day that Israel is experiencing?
So, Yaakov, I did suspect that I would be asked something about the political turmoil that is embroiling everything and anything within the state of Israel. It's very clear to anybody who follows the headlines there. I'm just back from Israel. I'll be going back in a couple of weeks back home. And it's very apparent that things have reached a low point within political discourse. Now, I just want to tell everybody something on this conversation, everybody who's listening to this conversation. People may have their opinions about the judicial reform. People may be supportive of it. People may be opponents of it. I want you to be very clear about what my opinion is on this matter. The state of Israel does not need this level of internal conflict within our borders, among our people, within our nation. We cannot afford it. We are a nation unlike any other nation. When other countries, other democracies find themselves so polarized that various sides of the political spectrum cannot come together, those nations will yet survive that turmoil, I hope. But as they come through that argumentation, as they come through that disagreement, one thing is very, very sure. They will not be rocketed by their neighbors from the north and from the south. The state of Israel, tragically, unfortunately, lives in a specific part of the world where our neighbors will not leave us to rest. And we cannot afford, regardless of where anybody sits intellectually on the subject of judicial reform, we cannot afford to choose, to make the choice to have massive unrest within our borders as our enemies unite in order to destroy us. And I want to recall the words of, frankly, my hero, Menachem Begin of blessed memory, a former prime minister of the state of Israel, who said about the existence of the Jewish people in the land of Israel, quote, "We were granted the right to exist by the God of our forefathers at the glimmer of the dawn of human civilization nearly 4,000 years ago. For that right, which has been sanctified in Jewish blood from generation to generation, we have paid a price unexampled in the annals of the nations." Now, Begin went on to say, quote, "There will be no fraternal strife while the foe of Israel is at Israel's gates." Now, we need to listen to the words of Menachem Begin on this day. We need to understand that self-inflicted injuries by way of self-inflicted internal strife, splits, divisions, those are not a luxury in which the state of Israel, the people of Israel, or its political leaders have any right whatsoever to expect themselves to indulge within and engage within. We cannot afford it. And to your question directly, I frankly don't think politicians should attend these ceremonies in an official capacity. I think that they should attend because many of them are mourners themselves. We all know that Prime Minister Netanyahu, for example, lost his brother, a hero of Israel, Yoni Netanyahu of blessed memory, in the hostage rescue operation known as the Raid on Entebbe, one of the storied examples of military courage and bravery and professionalism of the Israel Defense Forces. Should not Benjamin Netanyahu be able to attend a memorial service? Of course he should, but I think from the Prime Minister all the way down, as a consequence of the absolutely base level of political discourse that has come about and tragically emanates from all sides of the political spectrum in Israel, those politicians should be there in a private capacity, not a public capacity. I don't think that their words are the words that people wish to hear on this particular day. It's a consequence of their own words prior to this day and the toxicity that they have all sown in recent weeks. And so I would say attend, but attend as a private citizen. And remember, Yom Hazikaron, the day of Israeli remembrance, that's a day for the families of the fallen. It's not a day for politicians. It's not a day for politics. It's not even a day for the general public. I don't know if people know this, but on Yom Hazikaron, the families of those who have fallen. They are exempted from work, for example. Other individuals are not exempted from work. So this is a day for the families to mourn, to grieve. They've already had to carry the burden of wondering whether or not protests will break out by the gravesides of their loved ones because of the presence and potentially the words of politicians. Let them mourn in silence, let them mourn solemnly, and let them together with all the house of Israel find the strength to rise to their full heights as sons and daughters of Israel, who have lost sons and daughters, brothers and sisters of Israel in the fight for Israel and its security.
As you say, let them mourn solemnly, if only for a moment, as Herzl Levi also says, if only for one sacred day. I think that the formula that you just outlined here is certainly a realistic path to enabling that day to be honored as it should be. Now, at the beginning of this webinar, Rozita mentioned that right around the corner is Independence Day. And it's in the back of all of our minds. You know, it's deliberately designed this way to be uncomfortable, that for the next 24 hours, we are going to be remembering tragedy upon tragedy. It's unbearable. It's simply unbearable to go through these memories, and it's necessary. It's equally unbearable and necessary for every citizen to do this. And yet, you know, come evening time, it's a nationwide celebrations, Independence Day, and everybody's out in the streets, and it is a completely intention roller coaster ride from tragedy to celebrating Israel's 75th Independence Day. And there have been, you know, debates in the past here about whether these two days should really be so closely juxtaposed, and perhaps we need a day in between. And I wanted to get your thoughts on that. There have been interesting points made on both sides of the debate. The majority view seems to be to keep things as they are, but there is a minority that says we need 24 hours to process, you know, the Memorial Day and the emotions and the memories that it brings, and then move into Independence Day. And other people are saying, no, we cannot separate these 2 days because we cannot ever forget that our independence is completely built on the sacrifices that we commemorate during Memorial Day. Where do you stand on this?
So Yaakov, before I answer that, I know that you only have a couple more minutes, but I do want to conclude this with a prayer for the fallen, and I'll do that in a moment, but I assure you, you'll have time to go and to attend to your own solemn observance of Memorial Day. I'm firmly in the second camp, Yaakov. And I'm in the second camp because, quite frankly, this is how the Jewish people deal with seminal moments in their history. Just a couple of weeks ago, we celebrated the festival of Pesach, of Passover, and we read the Haggadah, and the Haggadah is a retelling of Jewish suffering, of Jewish slavery, of the bondage in which the Jewish people found themselves, and then the plagues and the hardening of Pharaoh's heart, and then the miracles and the crossing of the Red Sea. And then it all ends, the Haggadah, with the singing and the chanting of L'Shana Haba'ah B'Yerushalayim. Next year, may we find ourselves in Jerusalem. And it's believed that the Haggadah traces the story of the Jewish people from bondage to redemption, precisely because without understanding suffering, without understanding sacrifice, without understanding injustice, one cannot understand freedom. One cannot understand the importance of pursuing justice. One cannot understand the luxury of being a free people in our land. Am Chofshi be'artzenu, a free people in the land toward which the Jewish people yearned for millennia. So too is it the case with Yom Hazikaron preceding Yom Ha'atzmaut. It is a natural elision within Jewish culture and within Jewish liturgy and within Jewish existence today in the contemporary moment that we will go from the depths of our suffering, from the dearth of our existence into the brightest shining moments of our place among the nations here within the Jewish state of Israel. And so I'm in the second camp, and I would say that were we to separate those two, it would not be for me, Dayenu, it would not be enough for me. I think that we have to have that connectivity, that tissue within our hearts, our souls, and our intellect between the sacrifices that are made and the existence that we're privileged to have, and not to forget that, even as internal arguments are seemingly, tragically, the order of the day within the state of Israel. And so I hope that I've answered that question, and I hope
you
that...
absolutely have. And just before we conclude and you go on to your prayer, Let me try and squeeze one more question. And Israel's
Sure.
enemies, Hezbollah and Iran, they do this, on the fourth Friday of every Ramadan. It's Quds Day. It's the day that they recommit themselves to destroying the state of Israel, and they're dead serious in that objective. And the common thread in their statements from Tehran to Beirut has been that Israel won't make it to its 80th Independence Day. And they've said that, our own infighting is one of the main reasons that gives them hope. What is your response to those statements by our enemies?
Well, first of all, the infighting that they speak about within the states of Israel, they would do well to remedy their own infighting within the Muslim world. I think that we see Shias fighting Sunnis and different camps trying to destroy other camps. We remember the Iran-Iraq war. They are certainly no exemplars of unity over in the Muslim world, and we have nothing to learn from them when it comes to internal unity within the states of Israel. Secondly, the ability of the state of Israel to endure and to survive is going to be a combination of two things. Firstly, our own ability to come together and to stand firm in the face of our enemies and to defy our enemies by overcoming our internal differences so that we can overcome our external challenges. And the second will be by the grace of God, the Almighty. For me, when I served in the Israel Defense Forces, whenever I went into battle, whenever I went into combat, whenever I went to reserve duty, I made sure to put on my tefillin each and every day, and I made sure to say my prayers, and I made sure to walk around with a prayer book on my person wherever I went. I remember carrying that into Lebanon. I remember carrying that throughout Judea and Samaria, and I don't think that anyone in the Muslim world should believe that the Almighty's provenance, the idea that the Jewish people can be a free people in the land of Israel, is something to be doubted. Certainly not by thugs, barbarians, terrorists, and individuals whose opinions, frankly, are unimportant to me, except to defeat their bad ideas and to remain and to endure as a people. That's where I am on that, Yaakov.
Thank you very much.
I do pray, and I mean pray, that Israel and Israelis, we will overcome our internal differences, because it is only that internal fighting that can bring about this vision, this notion, this depraved vision that the state of Israel will not make it to its 80th year, but it will not be because of the deeds or the efforts of our enemies. It will be because of the breakdown of internal cohesion within the Jewish people. So
as we've struggled with, as our ancestors struggled with in history as well.
Yes,
I'm going to have to jump off, unfortunately, because in
Absolutely.
just a few minutes the siren will sound. So thank you very much.
You jump off, Yaakov. I'm going to read this prayer for our listeners, and then I will do the very same. Thank you so much, Yaakov. I always appreciate it. Thank you for another great candid conversation. So, friends, I'm going to read the prayer now for the fallen soldiers of the Israel Defense Forces. And then I'm going to read a prayer for those who serve on our borders and defend them, even as we conduct this webinar. May God remember the souls of his heroic children, the fighters of the Israel Defense Forces who fell in the wars of Israel in defensive, retaliative, and security actions and during the fulfillment of their duty, including the souls of the underground fighters and brigades who fought in the national struggle, all those who sacrificed their lives for the sanctification of God's name. And with the help of God, the Lord of Israel's campaigns, they brought about the revival of the nation and the state and the redemption of the land and the city of God. They were quicker than eagles and stronger than lions as they volunteered to assist the nation, and they saturated our holy land with their pure blood. The memory of their self-sacrifice and heroic deeds will never disappear from us. May their souls be bound in the bond of life with the souls of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, and with the souls of the other heroes and martyrs of Israel who are in the Garden of Eden. And now I want to recite the prayer for the soldiers who defend our country right now at this very moment. מי שברך אבותינו אברהם, יצחק ויעקב, הוא יברך את חיילי צבא ההגנה לישראל העומדים על משמר ארצנו וערי אלוהינו מגבול הלבנון ועד מדבר מצרים ומן הים הגדול עד לבוא הערבה ביבשה באוויר ובים. ייתן אדוני את אבותינו את אויבינו, ייתן אדוני את אויבינו הקמים עלינו נפגעים לפניהם. And that prayer for those who do not speak Hebrew says the following: may the one who blessed our forefathers, Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, bless the soldiers of the Israel Defense Forces who stand guard over our land and the cities of our nation, from the border of Lebanon to the desert of Egypt, and from the great sea to the Arava desert, on land, in the air, and on sea. May Hashem cause the enemies who rise up against us to be struck down before them. I thank all of you for being with us during this webinar in commemoration of the fallen soldiers of the Israel Defense Forces and the victims of terror who fell by way of horrific terror attacks against innocents within the state of Israel. And as was mentioned at the beginning of this program by Rozita, Pnini, my colleague and co-founder, we will move from this day of solemnity into a day of celebration by way of Yom Hazikaron. But before then, let us all take the time and the moment to reflect upon those who are lost unto us and to comfort those by whom they are survived. Thank you very much indeed.